All right, well, let's get today kicked off. For many of you that have attended these meetings in the past, we always start out with just a brief overview of what the Midwest Cybersecurity Alliance is, because we have new members that join all the time. Basically, what the Midwest Cybersecurity Alliance is a nonprofit organization, and we've been around for many years now. We all do this out of goodness of our hearts. We really try to address hot cybersecurity and privacy issues. And the way in which we deal with these issues, we try not to talk about them just from a legal perspective or just from an IT security perspective or risk management perspective. We try to bring all concepts together. So thank you so much for joining our session today virtually. As I mentioned a minute ago, we are trying and hopefully will be hosting our next meeting in person in January in our offices. But for many of you who attend all over the country, we're going to try to do it both in person, but a virtual option as well, or at least a recording to provide you. So stay tuned. Today's agenda, we're going to first talk about our housekeeping and continuing education credits. We're going to do a brief overview of our MCSA scholarship program and corporate sponsorship program. Scott Owens went through that last time. He's actually on the call. You can wave Scott. Allison's going to put up your contact information if anybody wants more information when we get to that point. And then today we're going to talk about just an amazing subject that I'm so excited about. And I know that I say this every time, but truly those are the only subjects we do talk about, things that are exciting. And we're really going to get into like, how do you address foreseeable cybersecurity risks? I mean, we all have skeletons in our closets. We all know that, there's not 100% security. And so really, what are the best practices around dealing with these foreseeable risks? And we have just an amazing program schedule that we're going to be addressing issues, again, not just from an IT technical security perspective, but also from a risk management and legal perspective. And then at the end, we have Q&A and we have networking time. We can all catch up. But as always, please feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation. Allison's going to go over, all the ways in which you can do that. Shoot questions into the chat box, raise your hand, show emotions. This really is supposed to be meant to be very practical. And so any burning questions you have, please feel free to jump right in. For background here, this is the Midwest Cybersecurity Alliance website. There is a sign-up function there. If you want to get access to any of our presentations, you can also reach out to me or Allison directly. We record them all. We also have a PDF of the presentation that we send out, after our session. Allison will send you out that information following our session today. But here is a link to our website. All right, Allison, I'll turn it over to you quickly to go through housekeeping.
All right, and Jen, I'll let you advance the slides. But just so everyone is aware, we are audio recording the program today. I think most of you have probably been on an MCSA meeting prior to this, but in case you're new to us, we do record these programs for playback purposes so that you all can benefit from listening again, or so that your peers can also listen if they weren't able to attend. So this is our legal notice that you are being recorded. For folks who need to access the recording afterwards, as Jen mentioned, you can reach out to Jen, myself, my colleague Lisa Freimark. Otherwise, for folks who are not able to be on the call, we do post these behind the member paywall, or the member login wall, I should say, of the MCSA website. It is free to create a profile so that you can access those recordings, but you do need to sign up through the MCSA website. So if you have any questions about that, or your colleagues or peers have questions, feel free to reach out. In terms of using Teams, if folks have not used Teams before, it's pretty intuitive, but we do ask that if you're not asking a question or actively presenting, that you please do mute your microphone and also turn off your camera. It's a little bit distracting otherwise. If you do have questions, you can either raise your hand using the raise your hand icon up at the top of your screen. There is also a chat bubble icon that you can use to type in your question or make any other commentary within the chat feature. So please do feel free to ask tons and tons of questions. And then again, if you experience any difficulties with the webinar platform, maybe it freezes or it gets kicked out, try refreshing your web browser if you're using a web browser to access Teams, or try exiting and rejoining the meeting if you do have problems. And if those problems persist, you can email myself Lisa Freimark, or you can enter a message in the chat box and let us know. And then continuing education credits, we are going to be applying in all applicable states after the program. So if you are a U.S. licensed attorney seeking CLE credit for today, there will be a couple of CLE code announcements that we will make throughout the program today. I provided the link to the attorney affirmation form in the chat box as well. I will provide that again as we get closer to making the first announcement. So if you're seeking credit, please download that form, fill it out in its entirety, including recording the 2 codes that we'll be announcing. Make sure you sign it and then return it to Lisa Freimark. Her email address is on the screen. We also have ISACA credit for anyone who has an ISACA certification. I also provided a link to that self-attestation form. You can download that and self-report those credits after the program. If there are any questions, you can reach out to myself or Lisa Freimark.
Jen, you're on mute.
Thank you, Scott. I was just saying, thank you, Joe, so much for sharing your icon. I wish we were all again in person. We're planning to do that in January. We have a session scheduled with Sikich to talk about new PCI risk assessment standards. We don't have a date set yet, but we will when we send out the follow-up email thanking everybody for this session, and look for an invite to follow. So just for background, we always put this up, but want everybody to know that Foley has a free state data breach notification chart. We update this quarterly throughout the year. The best way to obtain that is to simply just Google Foley 50 state data breach chart. It gives you an idea of what the legal requirements are, types of data that states cover. As you know, it's not just where you are located, but if you have an event or an incident, it's where all of the affected persons reside. So an incident of even 100 people can pick up many, many different states, but we update this throughout the year. Basically, all you do is you go to it, you click states that you're interested in, and each state pulls up a chart similar to this, which does a summary of the requirements. It's not every requirement, but at least it gives you a basic background of the requirements in those states. So we kind of did a preview of this in our last session, and we just wanted to give another update. Scott Owens actually did our update before, and we just want to continue to push that really for next year. We wanted to focus on scholarship, and we're going to be launching this over the next year. We would like to give out multiple awards of at least $1,000 to individuals that, you know, really are focusing on the cybersecurity field. And I don't know if Tina's on or not, but our last session was done by SysLogic, and Tina Chang, their CEO, has been in the Business Journal and others, and we've been talking about the fact that, you know, we all know there's just a lack of cybersecurity professionals, and it's only going to get worse. And we really, really want to do something to give back to our community. And the way in which we think about this, and if you need help in talking to your organization, if this is something you want to help us sponsor individuals in the community, it's really like sponsoring firefighters. I mean, these are community services. I mean, cybersecurity professionals really are just not technical experts. They really are our frontline defenders, and nobody is stealing information or coming in to steal secrets on foot anymore. It's all through the cyberspace, and it's just such a very important career and something that we all need. So if anybody wants more information, please reach out. We would love to get more students as well involved with MCSA. We've talked to many local universities. I mean, one of the issues is the students typically, well, now with COVID, it certainly has changed the game, but students typically, you know, do not like to attend events unless they're, you know, on campus. So if any of you are mentoring students, are involved with any sort of programs, once we go back to in person, or feel free to invite them, you know, to our webinar sessions as well. We would just like to get more involved with student communities. So we have various different levels of corporate sponsorships. We're trying to do things other than, you know, we'll talk about in a moment. Haylock, who's the sponsor of our session here, has been a long-term sponsor. We do have sponsorships where you know, to speak and co-host meetings. We have other sponsors where simply you could be a Kortner partner or a corporate ambassador. And, there are certain benefits that are related to those, but really a portion of those monies are going to go to scholarship because we really, would like to focus on that over the next year. So you've got the information up. Thank you, Allison. I see in the chat box, here is Scott's information. Scott, you can wave again, but Scott is really helping us get this program, started. So let's get into our program today. Again, thank you so much. Terry, I'll let you say a few words, but HALOC has been a very important sponsor for a very long time in the Midwest Cybersecurity Alliance. So we want to thank you so much for this amazing program today. And if you have a few words about your company, that would be great.
We are absolutely delighted to once again sponsor the Midwest Cybersecurity Alliance. The engagement from the members is just so great. I know it's a little bit different now with virtual, so I would encourage you all to use the chat or raise your hand and make it as interactive as we can. Today's topic, phenomenal. I'm looking forward to it. We got Chris Cronin, he's a partner with HALOC, and he's really one of the thought leaders in this entire space. And so I'm delighted to see it, and I work with him every day. So thank you all for your attendance. And most of you know us. We're a professional services organization based, 70% of our clients are out of the Midwest. Our flagship services are risk management, pen testing, and incident response readiness, and actual live response. So if you have any of those needs, certainly, chat with me afterwards. But with that, we can move on.
Great. Thank you so much, Terry. So the speaker today is me, Jennifer Urban. I'm a partner here at Foley. I'm based out of our Wisconsin office. I also have my colleague, Brian House, who's going to speak at the end. He focuses his practice in many areas, but one of them is SEC. And so he's going to really get into some of the legal issues about what do you do when you have these known foreseeable risks. But now I'm going to turn it over to Chris to get it kicked off into the presentation. Thank you so much. And please put all your questions in chat, jump in. We're a very casual group here, so please let us help you answer any question you have.
Great. And to prove casual, I think I killed the presentation. I have a deck up, so I'll share what I've got. And let me know if you see it. Are you able to see
Allison?
Well,
I do not see it.
Let me pull it back up because I have made some actual updates.
Okay, thanks.
Give me one moment.
Thanks.
Thank you. I guess, and while we're waiting, does anybody have any other events that are going on in the community they want to talk about?
I'm just about to post something because it's very relevant to what we're talking about today. The Center for Internet Security has a webinar tomorrow that shows their update to the risk assessment method that we authored with them. Because what we're talking about for the foreseeability model here, we've actually implemented in a free risk assessment method. We'll be describing the method tomorrow. So I just sent up the URL in case people want to register for that talk tomorrow.
Thank you. That's great. I actually just listened to a talk today. It was from a NIST fireside chat with the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence. And they had a huge section focusing on foreseeable risk. So this is certainly in the forefront of NIST and many organizations as well.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So thank you for joining. This is a topic that HALOC's been actually developing carefully over years. So we've been using the process that we're talking about and refining the process over a period of years, and we've worked with standards bodies, regulators, and Verizon, the authors of the Data Breach Investigations Report as well, to prove out what we were doing, and it kept coming out right. So we started to present it publicly this year. So we're really glad you're able to see this. But what we're talking about here is, in terms of what you're expected to know and disclose, what could you consider to be a foreseeable threat, and how do you know that it's foreseeable, and how foreseeable it is in your organization, and then what to do about it. So I'm going to start with my presentation of how you know what threats are most likely in your organization, and then we're going to switch over later where Brian's going to talk about how to use the information that we've got to conform to SEC requirements for disclosure. So let's jump in. So A quote that I originally saw this associated with Esther Dyson, but it turns out that she wasn't the first to say it, so I don't know who said it first. But the purpose of prediction is not to know the future, but to change it. I love that quote, and you'll see why why this is an important thing to consider as we talk about foreseeability of threats. Of course, you want to know what's going to happen so you can change it. That also creates sort of an analytical problem. Like if you changed that, how did you know you would have been right? And why you shouldn't even be curious about whether you were right. As long as we'll talk about that in a moment. So let's forecast the threats so that you can change your future to the one you want to be, rather than the one that could otherwise be inevitable. So here's what we're trying to say about knowing what your future threats means. It's securing your likeliest threat vectors. It's prioritizing the likeliest threats that create the most harm, and it's spending no more than you need to secure your organization. So what we mean by that last one in particular is if you know what threats are coming and you know which are going to create the biggest threat, you can put your resources toward those things rather than spending resources on things that matter less. So this is going to be an important thing to keep in mind as we look at these slides coming up. That's also the definition of risk management, the same terms. Right. Securing your likeliest threat vectors that create the most harm and spending no more than you need to secure your organization. Those who have heard Jen and Terry talk about duty of care risk analysis and CISRAM will recognize this. So here's the idea. When we talk about risk analysis in this talk, we're just going to be focusing on the basics. Risk equals impact times likelihood. We're not talking about maturity scores. We're not talking about audits. We're not talking about pen tests, but thinking about risk in terms of likelihoods and impacts. So HALOC is most known for helping people think through impacts, right? And today we're really focusing on what we've been able to develop with likelihood and what you can do with that. But with risk analysis, we're also trying to make sure that we're driving risk down by looking at impacts and likelihoods and bringing them both go down, all right? So let's take a look at a little bit about what we think about with risk analysis. When you've heard Terry and Jen talk about duty of care, they're talking about DOCRA and CISRAM. So DOCRA is this method for making sure that your risks that could impact you and the risks that could impact others have a balance. The balance is best met when you've reduced both to an acceptable level, but you want to be sure that you've taken care of your risk and others, right? DOCRA is duty of care risk analysis. It's the standard that says how you would do that with any kind of risk assessment you've got. And CISRAM is the first implementation of it that comes with instructions and workbooks so that you can work through how to apply DOCRA. It uses the CIS controls, but you can put any controls framework in it. We'll talk about that. Tomorrow, as I mentioned a moment ago, CISRAM 2 will be officially released. It's been on the CIS website for a couple of weeks now, but we're holding a webinar. We've got an author from the Verizon Data Breach Investigations report there because of what we're going to talk about here today. So you get a sneak peek about tomorrow's talk. We've got a state regulator who tells people to follow CISRAM if they want to demonstrate reasonableness. And we've got a CISO from a tech firm, Connell Gallagher from Flexera is going to join us, who's been using CISRAM to help with his program. So anything that I'm talking about here, I'm going to go into a lot of numbers and a lot of theory and a lot of that kind of stuff. But understand at the end of it, there's something very practical that you can grab a hold of and use. That webinar tomorrow will show you in detail how to get that. So this is how we use likelihood and risk analysis. Whenever we consider a potential harm of an incident, we have to think both of the impact and the likelihood of foreseeable threats, right? So how do we estimate the likelihood of foreseeable threats? Terry, I'm remembering you were at a discussion, I don't remember who it was with, and someone said, okay, I get that, but how do you risk assess unforeseeable threats?
Right. I had a board member ask that question.
And I thought, oh man, we're just working on the foreseeable ones now. Give me a break.
Well, that's exactly what I responded. I said, once you've completely covered all the foreseeable threats, then you can start to anticipate the things that aren't foreseeable.
Right. Yeah, eat your peas, then you can have dessert. So so here's what we try to do when we talk about this. We try to think of tendencies, right? You'll see why this is different from predictions in a moment. But think about likelihood this way, not what's going to happen to me. What's the probability of this happening to me this year? Ask this question: what kinds of breaches tend to happen in organizations like mine? Like, there are kinds of things that I do for a living. There are ways that I do those things. There are ways that I handle information. There are kinds of tech I use. There are ways I interact with the public. But if I have an understanding of how I do business and I can see a commonality of organizations like mine and see what's tending high, I got a good understanding of what that tendency is. I didn't have to predict very much at all. But where can we find tendency of breaches? So there's this database. It's amazing. It's called the Verus Community Database, and it's provided to us by Verizon. So when you have a very expensive phone plan, I have to thank you because it's paying for this. So I thank you. But here's what this is. You know, the Verizon Data Breach Investigations report that comes out every year. It's great reading, and you can tell that Verizon gets a lot of data. They get that data in part from the investigations that they undertake and from investigations that partners provide to them. So companies like Haylock, who do forensic investigations and this kind of thing, are invited to send information about the details that that we can tell about an organization, what were the causes, and this kind of thing. The Verizon team makes sure that the data is evidence, that it's plausible and it's real, and then they put it into their massive data set. If the incident has been publicly known, it's been reported publicly, they take that data and they put it out into the Verus Community Database, right? So what does that look like? It is a monster. So it is, it's a Scotch tartan. It's a lovely skirt from what it looks like. It's actually a huge flat data file. It's about more than 2,000 columns wide, and it changes with every edition. There's something different about the columns, but more than 2,200 columns wide and more than 9,000 rows deep. So that means it's about 9,000 records about different breaches, with about 2,200 really more characteristics about any kind of breach. It's a lot, right? But it's like, where did the attack come from? Was the attacker known? What kind of organization was it? What year did it happen? What did they steal? What assets were involved? What kinds of threat patterns were there? What defenses were there? It's like tremendous amount of data, right? Now, most of each record doesn't have a whole lot of data in it. They just have these tremendous amounts of spaces to put this stuff in. So it takes a long time to live in this data to understand what kinds of stories you can tell with it. Once you do a little perusing, you see they've sectioned off chunks of data. Like, here are the attack vectors. Here's the way that someone got in. Attack methods. Here's what they did to get in. Assets. These are the things they hit. And it could be multiple assets. They went through a website, and then they got to the database, and then they got to the Windows server under the database, and then they executed a jump over to another server, and then they grabbed a file. Each of those assets that were in one attack would be in one row. So there's a lot of reading to do, right? Victims. Who were the victims? What kind of organization was the victim? Where did they live? Attackers. What kind of attacker was it? Were they known to the organization? Were they an insider? Or were they an outsider hacker? Were they a state actor? There's a lot of data in here, right? So you can imagine with all this data, two things are very likely for anyone who's worked for data. There's probably a story in there, and there's probably a lot of work to find the story. But we've got some help to help you figure out. If you want to jump in here and play with it, there are ways for you to figure out how to do this. We're going to talk to you about that. But we're also going to point you to the CIS RAM to get some quick use of it. It'll be, yeah, we'll talk to you about it in a moment. So here's how you find tendencies in the Verus Community Database. You're going to ask questions about a threat characteristic, like how common is a certain threat vector or an attack method or a compromised asset? Like, how often am I going to see servers? How often am I going to see personnel? You want to find patterns in industries. So can I see that in certain industries, certain things happen more or less? You're going to see that, yes, very clearly. How about patterns over time? Will I see changes in characteristics of what's happening over time? And you're going to see, yes, absolutely. And we'll show you why that's important and useful. So now you have this other kind of likelihood where you're not going to be saying, what is the percentage chance of something happening to me this year? Because that's a really, really tough question to answer. You won't be asked when will I be breached and how. You'll be saying, what is the likeliest way I will be breached? How do organizations like mine tend to be breached? So you're not asking, will it happen? You say it will happen. What's the most likely way it will happen? Because accidents happen all the time, attacks happen all the time. What is the most likely way? That's a really helpful way to look at it, because now you can think, what am I going to tighten up most then, right? So that's just a quick breakdown. Probability is for the first example, and forecasting is for that second. We're looking for tendencies. Now, people say, but you can't predict cybersecurity threats. I think that's true. I think it's true that you can't predict them all, and I don't even want to. There are two reasons why you can't predict them. Well, one, you can't see the future, but two, once you know that there's a tendency, you better fix it. You better prove yourself wrong by fixing the thing that's most common. I don't want to go for accuracy in my prediction. I want to see that something's likely, and I want to verge away from it, right? So then we want to forecast, right? We want to estimate based on a tendency. And besides, cybersecurity innovates, but not much year over year. So when we work with our forensics team, and they talk to us about things that are going on, they always see the same things happen over and over again, and occasionally they see something interesting. But for the most part, it's the same things over and over again. You're going to see that in the data. So when folks fixate on the really rare thing, that's juicy and fun to think about. But if you're trying to figure out that rare thing, you're not paying attention to the things that happen all the time that are very predictable. So let's put ourselves in the position of which we had a really good, accurate prediction. Here's what you would say. We were breached this year and lost 1 million records, just as we predicted. Should you get a badge for being right? Probably not. Because we want you to think ahead so you change. Here's what we want people to be able to say. We saw that personnel tend to breach data by accident in our industry. So we removed their access to the crown jewels. Their eventual error released much less data than we originally estimated, right? You want to be able to say, there's no way we can help but make mistakes because of what we do. There's no way we can help but have websites out in the open that'll have some flaws. That's just the shape of our business. But what are we going to do so that when someone tries to get through that vector, they're unsuccessful? Or they get through the vector, but there's very little impact. You only know that if you know to pay attention to those things that happen most. So before I show you how to forecast, I'm going to show you what we find. So I'll show you what we end up with before I show you the how. So this beautiful picture, and I love this. It's the culmination of years and years of work. This is what's called a tree view. I don't know if you've seen this in Excel, but the tree view can be extremely helpful when you're grouping data. So what this is a picture of all breaches of all industries of all time inside the Verus community database. And the bigger chunks that have the smaller chunks in them, the ones that have titles like personnel error, personnel misuse, hacking system, malware, social engineering, etc., those are what we call threat clusters. That's a way to cluster the threats of a type thematically. And we'll tell you what that theme is in a moment. It might not be immediately obvious. Inside each threat cluster, we see smaller attack types. Under personnel error, we see undetermined vector, and then carelessness and misdelivery and device media, etc. Under personnel misuse, we have privilege abuse, land misuse, misuse of facility. These represent the commonality of threat types. So the larger the box, the more common it is. But this is for all industries, all time. This is interesting enough, right? Something to point out here real quick is that when you see undetermined in our data, that correlates very well to we didn't know. And we didn't know is that's not an, oh, there's nothing we can do with this. That's actually extremely important. Because if you got hit and you didn't know, that means you don't have situational awareness. You don't have good logging, you don't have good alerting, you don't have good SIEM, you don't have good forensics. You didn't know is actually a really important finding when you look at threat data, okay? But this is all organizations all the time. Watch what happens when we look at a specific industry. So personnel error, personnel misuse, malware, hacking system, these are the big ones, right? Let's take a look at retail. Retail changes. The biggest for retail, this is all time, not like the last 5 years or anything. The biggest threat cluster is physical facility. And then it's hacking systems. and then it's physical asset loss, and then personnel misuse. So let's talk about what that means. Let's go in deep and see for physical facility, why is this? Well, there's a lot of noise at tampering, disabled controls, victim at facility, public facility. Does anyone know what this is? Can you guess in retail? It's skimmers. It's attacking the point of sale systems. And sure enough, when you get down here, you see point of sale is a big vector of a tool that was hit. So when we're looking at retail, we know if we focus on the point of sale systems, we're going to reduce that threat cluster quite a bit, right? And it's different if we were looking at total population, we would be looking at personnel error first. Now this is public institutions, so this is government offices. Personnel error is the big one, and then malware, and then personnel misuse and hacking systems. Why would personnel error be so big? Carelessness and misdelivery are huge. Now think about that, why that would be in a public institution. What do public institutions do? They receive and give a lot of information to citizens. And there are a lot of employees doing this through mail, through manual processes, right? So there's a huge opportunity for people to make mistakes with sensitive information, and it proves out in the data, right? Malware generally happens because a lot of government systems are underfunded, and they just have not put the budget together to do the right thing here. So what we see is that your business sector says a lot about where your threats are going to come from. We'll show you more depth into that in a moment. But let's talk about how we forecast. There's a way we got this data. The first thing we did was know how the business operates. And this is a step you would take. You'd say, what is it that, where is our business happening? And then we would understand the threat landscape based on that. If I'm doing a lot of business here and less business here, I could probably draw a picture of what my threat landscape is. Then I'm going to get threat data. I'm going to align that threat data to my threat landscape. We'll show you how all this happens. And then we're going to organize data to see where threats have been, right, recently, because this is historical data. So let's start with step one, know how the business operates. So we're going to break this down into 3 chunks to make it real simple to see some obvious patterns. So when we think about a threat profile, a threat landscape for an organization, we try to think about where are interactions happening? Where is data? Where is it interacted? Where is it shared? What are the opportunities for failure? Now think about a hospital. This is a very physical type organization. You go to a care provider so they can give you care there. So there's a tremendous part of this that's physical. Systems are catching up. Now, what's interesting about systems is we don't, in healthcare, we don't have just one core system that takes care of everything, even yet. We have a distribution of systems in a lot of different places. So there are a lot of different kinds of systems in a healthcare environment. Think of a hospital. And then personnel is very big. Why is that? It's a lot of one-on-one in that kind of organization. You're seeing nurses, you're seeing doctors, you're seeing intake. There's and then people are processing your reimbursements, your insurance payments. You go to the pharmacist gives you your meds. It's a very personal business, a lot of one-on-one activity. If we take a look at banking, well, that's quite a bit physical. And you might think, well, I don't know, I don't go to banks much. Well, you go to ATMs a lot and they're ubiquitous. There are ATMs everywhere. They have a better sense of core systems. So even though there's a lot of volume of information, there are fewer systems when compared to the number of places and the number of personnel. There's still a lot of one-on-one activity in banks. And then information services. Think about, cloud services. Physical isn't that big a deal. You don't have a lot of cloud kiosks at malls and strip malls and stuff, but systems they got plenty of, and a tremendous variety of systems, many that they don't control because they're renting that space out to other people who use it. And then less personnel, because it just takes a few systems administrators, architects, engineers to make something like that work. So this is what we mean by having a sense of where your business functions. Where do the information assets, where are they? Are they physical? Are they systems? Are they personnel? So that's what we mean by that. We'll explore that more in just a moment, but we're going to take a quick CLE break.
Okay, at this time, we're going to announce CLE code number 1. Please record this code on your attorney affirmation form and send it to Lisa Freimark following the program. CLE code number 1 is X, P as in Peter, J as in John, J as in John, J as in John. Again, that's X, P, J, J, J.
Okay, thanks. So your threat landscape is where you conduct business. That's the lesson of this past few slides. So that's actually a pretty important thing to understand. It's a little more basic than you might be thinking. So now let's understand what your threat landscape is. Remember hospitals, we talked about that? Physical is very common, systems a little less, and personnel is big. Let's take a look at the hit index for hospitals, for healthcare, clinical healthcare. Personnel misuse and personnel error, right? A lot of people handling sensitive information, right? Next, physical asset loss. People dropping things and losing things, media, etc. Patient files. Social engineering comes next, hacking, physical facility malware, and then hacking web. And if we look in personnel misuse, we see privilege abuse. Now here's the difference between, I'll take a moment to describe what these mean. So personnel misuse and personnel error, we see as two different things for a couple reasons. One is that personnel misuse is someone violating a policy on purpose. They might be doing it for a good reason, but they're intentionally violating a rule. Personnel error is someone just trying to get their work done and they make a mistake. And the reason why we call those out as different is because you would do different things to reduce them. With personnel error, you're going to make sure that you've trained people as well as possible and you've given them the tools and the processes they need so that they don't make those mistakes. With personnel misuse, you've got a couple paths and it depends on your organization. You might need disciplinary procedure, you might need restrictive controls, you might need specific oversight processes, but one thing you're absolutely going to need is to understand why they're breaking the rules. Because if they have a real business purpose and you're preventing them from doing it because of a business control or because of a security control, your security control may be too burdensome. It may be causing people to work around it and taking these chances. So we think about personnel error and misuse as two different things. That's why we'd make them distinct, okay? And then physical asset loss because they're handling a lot of this media physically. So there's an awful lot of opportunity for that kind of mistake. Let's look at banking. Big on physical because ATMs and banks are ubiquitous. Some courses, a good collection of core systems, and then lots of personnel. And when you look at the hit index, the information that we've broken it down from the various community database, physical facility is huge. Then personnel misuse and physical asset loss and personnel error. Why is physical facility so huge? Well, again, we saw this with retail: tampering, disabled controls, victim at facility, surveillance, public facility. These are people putting skimmers at ATMs, right? Now, it's interesting. We've got a client who's a retail bank, a mid-sized retail bank, and they were talking about whether or not they were going to go to cardless cash. And the idea is, if you've heard the concept, you would have a barcode on your phone, and instead of putting your ATM card in where it could be susceptible to skimming, you would just show the barcode at a reader, and it would just read you, say, oh, this is you, and then you'd put your code in and that kind of thing. And I said, well, be careful, because when you look at the actual data, you do have tampering and disabled controls, but you also have surveillance, and that's these pinhole cameras. And a pinhole camera, when you're using your card, is reading the card number and even the 3-digit code if it's if it's the right payment card, and the name, and it grabs this stuff, right? But if you're using cardless cash that way, and you've got these cameras that are just collecting scan code after scan code, they're going to start to recognize certain patterns, and they're going to be able to feed data directly into the network and create direct to network attacks. And have cash come out of machines when they're not even there. So the point of this is that you want to know not just the big chunk of data, but what's causing that big chunk of data to be what it is. And as an organization, what do you do? Do we have any people with retail banks or credit unions in the group today? Because if you've been subject to audits by FDIC or ASET using the FFIEC document or the forgetting what I know they've been going back and forth with the NCUA with their audit, but it's basically the FFIEC method. They'll have you look at security controls for everything they can think of, but they never touch ATMs. Isn't that amazing? They've got this maturity model of evaluate, but you're looking at networks, you're looking at systems, you're looking at people and training.
How about the SCAT?
No, well, no. So yeah, it'll come to me. The NCUA. Anyway, yeah, it'll come to me. And they've gone back and forth with a couple things. This is the Intrex thing that they've tried to go back to. They've been going back and forth. But this is really interesting because if you look for controls at ATMs, you won't see them at all. And look how common the attacks are there. For the banking, this is both retail and commercial banking. Right, so you really want to look at foreseeable threats and not rely on audit protocols because the auditors they're behind, right? They're not looking at the latest data. The FFIEC was developed, I think, what, Terry, 8 years ago is when we did our first FFIEC evaluation. So they go back. And then for information services, where do you think that big one is? Hacking systems, and then hacking web. And then personnel error. It's interesting. Personnel error, misconfiguration, and carelessness has a lot to do with what drives personnel error in information systems. But here's the information services. But here's the other thing too. Big undetermined method and undetermined vector. Remember what I said about those? Imagine that you're running information services and you don't have what you need to actually see what's causing breaches. So we see very often when I mentioned our forensics team, when they're on an incident response, here's generally how things go. It's a Friday, late morning. We get the call saying we got some weird stuff Monday over the weekend. Monday morning we went in to check it out. We thought we could take care of it, but we don't want to go into another weekend with a problem. Can you help us? This conversation happens over and over again. Well, tell us what's going on. Then we hear the deal. We get the engagement going. Everything's in order, and then we say, okay, we need you to show us these certain things: system logs, network logs, any kind of forensics you've got. And as we talk about that, the client almost invariably says, we were hoping you could tell us where our logs were. Happens a lot. And it shows in the data because this is a common area where people are missing, right? But again, we've got a foreseeability issue. We know that everything is something that we can see coming. And these are the signs of our blind spots, the undetermined method and undetermined vector on both hacking system and personnel error, right? That's a good way to see that. That's a blind spot, and you get that blind spot taken care of by getting better logging in. So the Verisk Community Database, if you look at the Verizon data, you see that they aggregate and group industries at a fairly high level. But if you actually look at the Verisk data underneath, you can find some really good breakdowns that aren't in the that aren't in the Verizon breakdowns. You can find the difference between banking and non-banking financial services. You can distinguish between nonprofits and public administration. These are distinctions that are just not made in the Verizon data, but there are a lot of industries here. You very likely see yours here, or if you don't see it here, you'll see it in the Verisk data. So let's test this hypothesis. So you might say, okay, so you showed us a bunch of things that you knew would come out just fine, where the threat landscape looked like the business, but I'm going to test, and this is one of my favorite things to do with clients when we show this to them. I'm going to have you test to see if we're right about a threat landscape looking like the business. So take a look at this. We've got a lot of personnel error, a lot of personnel misuse. What's really, so skimmer, there's barely any skimming going on. So let me ask, is this a fast food chain? Is it a financial advisor, or is it a hotel chain? So think about what each of those are doing. And you may have an answer, but it's a financial advisor, right? Because financial advisors have lots of one-on-one contact with customers where they're handling sensitive data. Most employees are handling personal information of some kind. lots of delivery and distribution of personal information, right? Mailings, emails, that kind of thing, and rare on-site transactions, which is why skimming is such a low profile deal, right? So you can look at a threat landscape and get a good sense of what kind of business it is. That's how predictable this is. That's how predictive this is. Or not predictive, but forecastable this is. So here's a phrase that I think this was Mark Twain who said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. If it wasn't Mark Twain, it was someone around that time. So business changes slowly enough that you can forecast threats landscapes based on what you saw previously and recently. We don't change our technical infrastructures as industries very rapidly. Our go-to-market methods, industry by industry, are pretty stable over time. They don't change that much. Customer interaction vectors change, but over time. Because these things are fairly stable and fairly fixed, then our threat landscapes are. So let's take a look at how we get the threat data. We can find technical threats at a set of groups like MISP, OpenCTI. We can get CVE scores. We can get commercial vendors who give us tools that say, hey, this is big now. This isn't so big. Be very alert for this today and calm down about it tomorrow. That's good for tactical prep and response. So, hey, I'm noticing a lot of things hitting on my web servers, and I don't know what's going on. And oh, look, everyone's getting hit on their web servers who are at this AWS data center. Something's hitting the fabric at this AWS data center. It helps you think tactically about what's going on, right? When you look at all reported threats, not just the technical things that are on the wire, that's really good for planning, like a year out. What should my budget be given the trends that are happening and that are pretty stable over time? You can get that kind of data from the Verus Community Database, that's free. Privacy Rights Clearinghouse, that's free. It's less data with less characteristics, but it might be easier for some to digest. And then if you belong to an ISAC, an Information Sharing and Analysis Center, that's a really, really good way to get shared data as well. All right, so those are places where you'd get it. Let's take a look to see what we can do to align threats to our threat landscape if we use the Verus Community Database. Now remember this thing, more than 2,200 columns wide, about 9,000 rows deep. There's a lot of data. But what we're going to do is we're going to look at the kinds of data that can help you manage a problem. Remember when I made the distinction between personnel error and personnel misuse, saying we make a distinction because you would do different things about them to reduce them. You can't tell everyone to behave and take care of both misuse and error. So you're going to attack those problems as if they're different. So now let's take a look at the kinds of data that you find in Verus. We want to think about how our business functions and what we can do to manage. So there are some basic facts about who, what, when, where in the database. There are data classifications. This was personal information. This was banking information. This was health information. We know the nationality and location of the origin of the target. We know whether third parties were involved or not to some degree. Here's what's interesting. We found industries and sub-industries, threat actions, threat actors, and assets. That becomes interesting. So Haylock spent a long time, many, many months just understanding what the data was, and then many months putting together data models that made sense, and then many years refining this, working with authorities and working with our clients. And we found these four factors to be the most interesting. We hear a lot of people talk about sizes of breaches and financial impacts, and we find very little correlation. Both little correlation in the data and little correlation in reports. So think about the Verizon Data Breach Investigations report. They'll say, we looked at the data and we found 52 cents per record were the impacts for the breaches. And then you go to the Poneman reports and it says, this year we estimate $257 per record in a breach. Well, that's a huge difference, the less than $1 or more than $200. And they both say, with certainty, this is what I find when I look at the data. Well, they're looking at different data sets and they're asking different questions. Poneman's interested in the long game. I want to know of certain organizations of a certain size, and he's looking at smaller organizations, Larry Poneman. And he's looking at the initial and the long-term costs. So your primary and your secondary costs. Secondary costs being like the results of lawsuits, settlements, fines and fees, things that happen with regulatory oversight, having to reinvest in systems. That's how he gets this bigger number. And Verizon is looking at, hey, what was your initial cost? And if they learn more, they add more. But that's why their numbers are so divergent. So we don't look at the size of the breach or financial impacts because we're not finding a lot that correlates to a story that you can tell or something that you can manage. But what we found the real consistency in is the industries and sub-industries, the threat actions, the threat vectors, how they got in, and the assets that got hit. All right, now that we figured that out, what we did was we asked some threat characteristics, like what we talked about earlier. What's the commonality of certain threat vectors, of certain attack methods, and the commonality of certain compromised assets? How commonly are these things showing up, and do they align to industry types? And do those characteristics grow or shrink over time? And sure enough, we found the patterns. So I'm going to show you a little how-to, because if you're comfortable with the data, we want you to be able to get some capabilities. And if you're not, and you want to just get your feet wet and try it, there's that CISRAM version 2 document, or you can give us a call and we can help you figure things out too. That's what we're in the living. That's how we earn our living. So we're happy to help if you get into some tricky stuff. If you know how to use pivot tables in Excel, then you're going to be able to do the kinds of analysis we did. We're giving you the idea of where to get the real good stuff. It's those 4 items we pointed out earlier. Some have access to statisticians who use a programming language called R. And R is just a programming language that allows you to do this kind of statistical manipulation. But if you know pivot tables in Excel, what you're able to do is pull out records about all the threats in these 9,000 rows and select specific things like what we talked about. The information about threat vectors, attack methods, compromised assets, and which industries were involved, and grab the years too, because it will help you trend over time. What you're able to do with pivot tables then is just to take the data and twist it to ask specific questions that you've got. So if we were to say, I want to know the threat clusters and the industry that's involved, I'm going to select these two and I'm going to make a little table out of it. So it's a pretty great tool to have for Excel pivot tables. We encourage you to use that if you're good with it, or if you have that capability. And again, CISRAM 2 if you want to see how to apply it. Let's take a quick CLE code break.
And at this time, we're going to announce CLE code number 2. Please record this code on your attorney affirmation form and send it to Lisa Freimark following the program. CLE code number 2 is 0 O Y D as in dog, A as in apple. Again, that's 0 O Y D A. Thank you.
All right. So we've taken a look at that various community data, and it's really way too large for us
Chris,
to
can I ask
explore.
you a question?
Yeah, sure.
Sorry,
sure,
I don't want to interrupt, but
Yeah,
I'm
please
just
do.
logistically, trying to figure it out. So,
Yeah.
so if someone can't figure this out on their own, and I know CSRAM is doing it. So this chart right here,
Yeah.
they can download that. I just want to be clear themselves. They can download it. And if they know how to work the charts, then they can come up with their own threat vectors. Otherwise, how do they call you? And I'm not just trying to sell, I just don't understand. Like they call you all and then you help them walk through this on the front end of CISRAM?
No, so let me walk you through. What you would download is the various community database. That's that huge 2,500. Okay. Right. Now,
Yep.
You would only do this if you're comfortable with playing with data this large. Right. So this is if you're not comfortable using pivot tables or using R, then definitely use the CISRAM version that's free.
Okay.
If you find yourself doing this work and you're saying, I'm having a hard time analyzing this, figuring out how it applies to me, I'm saying we make our living doing this. If you need our help, you can certainly hire us to come in and help you do it.
So
yeah.
So Chris, the difference between the big, massive Varus community database and what CISRAM's given you is CISRAM bunches everything together, so there's less distinction between threats. Is that really, you get everything watered down a little bit more into clusters of threats versus the minutia that you could get from the Verus community database, just to distinguish between the two, right?
Yeah. So yeah, what we're going to talk about in just a moment is how you use this data in a risk assessment. Because and that's what CIS-RAM is doing. It's saying, I'm giving you all this threat data in a data set, and I'm telling you it's most and least common for all industries. That's their free approach. It's too difficult to create something industry by industry and then give it away for free because the maintenance is so heavy. But what they're doing is they're saying, like what we're about to show you, I can tell you what the likelihood of a problem in your organization if I look at the commonality of the threat and the capability of your control to stop that threat. And if I can pair those two, I can give you a likelihood.
Okay, that makes sense. And then
yeah.
you could add in ISAC data too, that's specific
Right.
as well.
Yeah, absolutely right. Yep. Yeah. And now if you needed that industry by industry breakdown, so if you were saying, look, we're a manufacturer, that data won't be in the CIS-RAM. That breakdown won't be there. The data is in the Verus community database. You can find that. You can find, let me see all the manufacturers, and then let me see the threats. But you're going to be comfortable using the data in there to do that. Or you can just say, hey, look, can you actually help me do this? Then yes, you can call on us to do that and we'll help you do it. But you know, as a project, there's just a lot that goes into that. If you're comfortable with the data, jump right in. Okay. So let's now organize the data to see where threats have been. So remember this view, this is clinical healthcare, all records of all time, right? Now, all records of all time goes back to, I think, 2012 or 2011 when you started to get bulk of data in the Verus community database. They do have data that goes back to 1970, believe it or not. This is a breakdown by threat cluster. So if I were to look at the year 2016, I'd see personnel error as the leading cause. I marked this one in yellow and I marked malware in this sort of orange-brown for a reason. But personnel error was the biggest cause of issues in 2016, and then personnel misuse is second, and then malware, hacking systems, social engineering, etc. In 2017, so let's say I'm doing my risk assessment in 2017. I can look at my 2016 data and say, I'm, you know, I have to be sure my controls are good for those common things like personnel error and personnel misuse, etc., and malware. Back in 2017, personnel error and personnel misuse switched and malware stayed where it was, fairly stable, right? Then personnel error goes back up, personnel misuse goes down, and malware shrinks. It goes down, down, down. By 2018, that's what the data says. Now, if we know about ransomware and ransomware trends and realize ransomware is malware, what do we know is going to happen in 2018? Well, the data tells us it rises to the top. That's when we started to get ransomware hitting healthcare providers heavy, right? Now, let's say you were doing your risk assessment in 2019 and you're using 2018, 2017, 2016 data. You know malware is a contender. You might even see that it went down. You could very well be surprised that it grew this much. It would be understandable why that caught you by surprise. But by 2020, you better not be surprised. Right? In 2020 or 21, you better not be surprised. So when we're talking about foreseeable data, foreseeable threats, we are talking about what we know to be a trending. And we know that there might be an occasional jump, but for the most part, we have stability because personnel error, personnel misuse, and malware were always near the top. Malware took a break one year and then slam got heavy. So we want to be sure that we're looking at our industry and we're looking at recents and we're looking at trends and we're in order to know what's coming up. So it's not enough to say.
Chris, one other question.
Sure,
I was just thinking through,
yeah.
You know, the data that's out there, I mean, it's like a plaintiff's lawyer's dream. You know what I mean? To say,
yeah.
Look at this. I mean, I would not say that, you know, this is necessarily standard of care, that you have to be aware of this data that's out there.
Yeah.
You know, and know that, but I certainly, while you're talking through it, I mean, I think in my mind, I mean, what a great way to bring a case to say, well, you should be aware of this because this has been reported for years. You know, these sectors, you can't say that this is something that was unforeseeable. It's interesting.
You've got a good point. And, we work with regulators. So HALOC does quite a bit of work as expert witnesses for defense, plaintiffs, and regulators. And regulators are holding up the Verizon data breach investigations report when someone's been hit by something, and they say, honestly, we didn't see it coming. And regulators can say, look, here are 5 years of the Verizon data breach investigations report. How is it that you didn't see this coming?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm trying to get to. I mean, I would
right.
say but I do think that, in this area in space, we're still dealing with best practices, more per se law.
Yeah.
But I certainly see this developing as more standards, in addition to the Verizon report.
Yeah, and the reason why HALOC works with Center for Internet Security is because we know that not a lot of people have this data handy to them. And we know the investment that it takes to make it happen. We are happy to help people when they need something comprehensive. And at the same time, if there's something that we can provide the public where people can get help with, now it's much more generic data. But they can say, look, in the general population, I saw the personnel error was big, and that's why I paid attention to my team. You'll have a more plausible argument, right? Now, the organizations that care more, that have contractual issues, that have regulators who are really interested in them, makes more sense to have something more comprehensive. But you really hit it on the head. This is like years of evidence, right?
Yes. Which is
here's
concerning as someone who defends companies all the time.
Right.
Where this is going.
Right. But so here's the defense slide. Because what this is saying, well, I'm sorry, the next one's the defense slide. What we're doing is we're saying, I can actually look at how commonly something occurs, how commonly a threat cluster occurs. If I don't look at the space, and this is confusing. It's pretty, but it's confusing. I want to actually now break this down into numbers. And then I want to be able to say, I could have protections against them. I could prioritize which I would pay attention to and which I wouldn't. And this becomes really, really helpful as you're preparing your environment, because you can say, if something's happening more, then I need to have a plan that shows greater maturity. So I won't tell you the story of specific cases and specific clients, but I can tell you in general, when we're working with regulators and an organization shows that they thought this through, I thought about the likelihood and the impact to me and to others, and I had a plan. And I wasn't even far along in that plan because no one taught me about risk assessments until earlier this year. And I've got my risk assessment and I got my plan and I'm thinking about me and I'm thinking about others. Regulators will not take that fight, because even if they have the tremendous data about what could have happened, as long as they see that someone thought through a plan, they'll say, well, my goodness, you are head and shoulders above just about everyone else I see. And a regulator does not have a tremendous amount of resources to go after a company. So if they think you've got a good defense, a reasonable defense, look, I knew my risk, I knew their risk, I had a plan, they'll say, I've got an easier win with someone who doesn't have a risk assessment done.
And I can't agree more than that. I mean, people ask, what is the bottom line, how you defend companies post-breach? It's telling a story that they are simply a good actor and a bad thing happened to them.
Exactly.
And the more data points you have to show that the company was investing in cybersecurity, took it seriously, had a living, breathing program that evaluated risks, had policies and procedures and trainings, et cetera, which literally the regulators ask you. I deal with this all day long, every day.
Yep.
Regulators are now cybersecurity experts. They understand all of these things. And while there's not an exact per se requirement that regulators require, all of this certainly goes a huge way. I mean, that is what I do every day, all day long, talking to regulators about, this is a good company. I mean, you can't prevent against everything, but they certainly have all of the components of a cybersecurity program in place, and they actually try to predict. I mean, I will tell you honestly, I don't see this as often in responses to this level. But I agree with you. At that point, regulators have to pick and choose, what companies they're going to go after. And typically they pick, low hanging fruit that have nothing, no policies, no sort of, and they literally ask. I mean, I just got a regulator follow-up request. Well, I get them every day, but I got one where you would be shocked to know how detailed the regulators get in the weeds, including they specifically ask you, what are all the, pen test, vulnerability test, risk assessments, list every single assessment you did 6 months to a year prior to this incident. I mean, and I do think that this is cutting edge in the next layer to say, what were the threats? Did you actually anticipate this threat? I haven't seen them go there yet, but if you're doing a regular risk assessment and then you add duty of care DACRA on top of it, and then, I mean, I can't imagine this is that much more, you know what I mean, to add this little piece. I'm just saying, as a lawyer, this would blow regulators out of the park. And everybody asks me all the time, just tell me what I need to do to get into a safe harbor so I'm safe and I don't have to, can you tell me how many penalties I'm gonna get? I mean, regulators do not penalize organizations by how many records were, I mean, plaintiffs in courts can penalize you and issue penalties that way, but regulators typically do not. Regulators simply are looking at, were you a good or bad organization? Did you take this seriously? And I really do think this is the next level. And I really do think that it would stop them in their tracks. If you could present data like this, they'd be like, what? And they would just move on because they've got so many other fish to fry out there. So anyway, I really do find this fascinating and a wonderful proactive approach that I can't imagine, seriously, and I don't know pricing or anything, that's not what we're talking about, but I can't imagine this takes that much extra effort to throw that on top of your annual risk assessment.
If you've got the data, you're exactly right. And again, if describing the method and the theory is one thing. If you're just taking a look at CIS RAM 2, you'll see that it's tremendously automated for small organizations. It's less automated for moderate organizations. If you need something comprehensive, you really do need a pro to be working with you on it, because it gets hairy real fast. But the models are now available and free. So as long as they are, use them, and you'll get a real good sense that that you've taken this next step. It's been a hill to climb, but I think we've provided a good benefit. We'd like people to take advantage of it. Well, I want to be able to get through this pretty quickly, so Brian can help folks with the SEC guidelines. What we want to point out here is there is no exact science to finding the right level of maturity for a commonality. It doesn't exist. But what we want to do is just drive people toward the right thinking. If something is very common, you don't want a weak control. If something is not happening very often, you don't want to overinvest in a control. We'll talk about just a moment about how you get that. It seems right to have capable controls over things that happen often enough. Seems right. I'm saying that on purpose, because what I'm not saying is you must have a certain maturity for a certain percentage. And that would be false to say that there is such a thing. We just are trying to show that you thought through that something should be more robust if the threat was more common. This is just a basic slide rule, where we're saying, if you could look at the percentage of the commonality of something, and this just repeats there 5 times, 0 through 20, 21 through 40, this is the top row, 41 through 60%, 61 through 80%, and 81 through 100%. These are quartiles, quintiles, I'm sorry, of commonality. And what we're doing is we're matching 1 quintile per second row maturity of the control. So what we're able to do is pair 1 quintile of commonality per maturity, and then we're going to associate it with a likelihood score. It's just a bell curve shaped slide rule is all that is. And all we're trying to do is say, find a way to match the strength of a control to its commonality to determine how likely is it that this is going to be the way you're going to get hit. And again, this is just kitted for you in CIS RAM 2 for free, so you can see how it works, but it's just data for everybody. You could use this and build your own metric for it if you'd like. But we recommend you look at CIS RAM to get the basics. And of course, if you're already a client of Haylock, and I know I recognize some names here, let's make sure that we're doing this for you as well. So duty of care risk analysis, again, we just talked about that real quick because knowing the likelihood is one thing. We also have to apply it to the impacts. For the legal heads out there, this is now being circulated as the definition for a reasonable security control. What this is basically doing is comparing two states, your risk in one state without a control and your risk with a control. The idea is that if you've got, if the amount of burden you took on for the amount of benefit to the public, if the amount of burden is less than the amount of benefit, you've got a reasonable control. If you take on too much of a burden to give a smaller benefit, that's not a reasonable control. You can't ask someone to overcompensate for a risk to someone. But what's embedded in here is the idea that when you're doing your risk analysis, you're looking at the risk to yourself and the risk to other people and making sure you don't overextend yourself. There's a way you do that using the real data when you've got it. If you know, I won't walk you through this whole thing because we're running short on time. But what we want to be able to do here is have a risk assessment method. You've probably seen methods like this when Terry and Jen have described DOCRA in earlier talks. And again, you can see this in CIS-RAM. But what we're doing is we're looking at a threat up top to understand a current risk, a risk to our objectives, our mission, our obligations. So our risks to us and to others. And then to pair it with likelihood to come up with a risk score. So remember at the beginning we said your risk is an impact and a likelihood. With DOCRA and CIS-RAM, our impact is the worst case scenario for us or others. And the likelihood is what we've been able to derive from the Veris community database. And then we say then our score, our risk score would be 10. If you know CIS-RAM and DOCRA well enough, you'll understand why one would be acceptable or not. But then what we want to do is put a control in place that reduces risk to an acceptable level. So when we've got this likelihood score, we've taken the time to show how we come up with this forecasting. It's not just enough to know what's coming, but it's to know how well prepared you are based on the strength of your control, and then asking what would be the impact to us and to others if something were to happen. We've got to put that likelihood into our risk analysis in order to make it something actionable, all right? So I'll wrap up real quick with this idea. If you are a data geek or you have access to a data geek, jump into the Veris community data. You'll find it at veriscommunity.net. The actual data is there in JSON and CSV format. So you can open it in Excel if you want. And if you're good with pivot tables, you can start to play around and start to get some really interesting trend data out of it. Or if you have a statistician available to you, you can use this programming language R. And I'm also mentioning this idea of the CIS-RAM. You can actually run a risk assessment. And it's something you should do sooner than later. And if you use the CIS-RAM tools that are, again, freely available to you, you'll see how this works. Very automated process. It doesn't take a whole lot of work to figure it out. The implementation group 1 version comes out tomorrow. So that's for small organizations that don't have technical resources available to them. They can run a risk assessment using this free version. Implementation group 2 comes out in a month or two. That's for more capable organizations. And 3 is for experts. But they'll all demonstrate to you for free how to do all this in your organization. All right. And then finally, if you're going to need to check in your risk analysis on a regular basis to be sure you're keeping up, because as you saw, the risks change over time. So you're going to want to continue your risk analysis over time as well. I'll take questions if they're there, but I want to be sure we get over to Brian's material over the SEC guidance as well. But are there any questions? Okay,
yeah.
Brian.
So I have one question. So
yeah,
this is Brian. This is Brian from Chrome. So we're ISO 27001 certified for ISMS. So I'm curious if anyone else in your organization is or is pursuing that. This is really our first time here.
You mean anyone at Haylock is?
Or anybody here, any participants that are actually ISO 27001 certified. Is that common in the US or becoming more common? So we work for Crohn's, right? We're a German-owned company, and 27001 is pretty prevalent in Europe and not necessarily here in the US. So we haven't really interacted with a lot of either vendors or customers that are 27001 certified.
It's gaining traction with the SaaS providers out there, those that have a lot of clients in the cloud who then have a lot of clients. So certainly the AWSs and Azures and the Salesforces, they all have the ISO certification because it's an easy way to get through the vendor risk assessment process. So if you're in a position where you have to demonstrate to lots of people where there's potentially a lot of impact, that you have a strong security program, ISO is the way to go. Chris and I are both ISO auditors, and Chris is an ISO implementer on top of it for 27001. So it's gaining traction. We've been probably implementing for 10 plus years ISMSs for ISO 27001. It's like 1 or 2 a year. Out of 800 clients, it's still not a huge amount, but we're not necessarily getting them all certified. We're implementing partial ISMSs for the rest. And what does a partial ISMS look like? They know their scope and boundaries. They're performing a risk assessment. They have objectives. They're continuously improving to get the risk down to an acceptable level to all interested parties. That is a partial ISMS. All the strict documentation to get ISO certified requires a bunch of overhead that, a few clients a year are willing to go through, but the rest are putting together partial ISMSs.
Perfect. Thanks. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Great. Again, my name is Brian House. I'm a partner here at Foley in Milwaukee in the SEC enforcement and securities litigation area. I do a lot of work with companies on governance issues, working with boards and the financial reporting function on all kinds of things relating to enforcement, but also disclosure. And so what I wanted to talk about today is SEC guidelines on cyber risk and disclosure issues. Now, I recognize that not everybody here is with is in a public company. Companies regulated by the SEC, but I think it's helpful to look at how the SEC approaches these issues, how guidance is changing, what their enforcement attitude is. And even if you're not regulated by the SEC, you may not be a public company or a financial services company that's directly regulated by the SEC, you still may have investors. You still may engage in transactions in which someone could later claim that you breached a duty to disclose. And you certainly have a reputation to think about. So I think this discussion about disclosing these issues really is important. And it goes right to what Chris was talking about. Now, the SEC hasn't spent nearly as much time thinking about this stuff as Chris and Terry have. They are way, way behind on this. But you can't open the Wall Street Journal or watch the TV without hearing something about cyber in Washington. The White House has made it a priority. The SEC has made it a priority. But it's like a lot of things, a lot of ideas, a lot of things, big things on the agenda. And so it'll be interesting, certainly over the next year or two, to see what progress is really made. But what I thought I would do is sort of set the stage and the background to talk about where we've been. What are the SEC guidelines on disclosure? There's not much. The SEC has provided guidance on this issue only twice. And the first time the SEC ever really addressed disclosure for companies was just 10 years ago. 10 years ago was the first time the SEC really called this out. And that was in some guidance that basically instructed companies that they had to disclose cyber risks if those risks were among the most significant factors that make an investment in the company speculative or risky. Well, what do investors think is risky? Why would an investment in a company be speculative? That is really not very detailed guidance. But the SEC went on and said that the companies should take into account a lot of relevant information, including the kinds of things Chris is talking about. Research regarding prior cyber incidents, severity, frequency of those incidents, and then probability. Including quantitative and qualitative. And yes, the SEC cares a lot about qualitative issues, management, what kind of governance does the company have relating to these kinds of risks? And then, what is the reputational impact, obviously. As many of you know, as a public company, there are risk factor disclosures, and so a lot of companies in 2011 started making risk factors disclosures, describing the business a little bit, and at least introducing for the first time that there was risk associated with cyber incidents. In February of 2018, the SEC issued additional guidance, and this time they emphasized the importance of disclosure controls and procedures. Didn't provide a whole lot more detail. There was a lot of discussion about materiality of cybersecurity events, and Chris just went through a whole, all the different factors that you can think about and the severity of the risks. But the guidance focusing on materiality was really not particularly new. Going back to 1934 and the Securities Acts in 1933 and 1934, the concept of materiality obviously has been present, and so this is just a layer on top to try to get companies to focus on materiality in terms of their cyber risks. And the potential financial, legal, and reputational issues that would accompany a breach. One of the things the SEC talked about in 2018 was that cost is a factor. I mean, you can't, and when you're thinking about what's material and what your controls are, you can obviously consider costs of mitigating and preventing cyber risks and costs associated with maintaining those cyber protections. So it's sort of the sliding scale that Chris talked about. There was a lot discussed in 2018 based on timing. In my world, in the enforcement world, in the defense world, you always want to collect information and study it and decide later when to decide if you need to make a disclosure or not. In 2018, the SEC said you can do an internal investigation, but you can't simply avoid disclosure based on that. You might need to say something and then provide an update later. And then obviously along the lines of what Chris was saying, the disclosures have to be tailored to a particular cyber risk, or at least they should be. I mean, you can't talk in a vacuum. You need to analyze your industry and what your particular risks are. I thought it was interesting in the discussion when Jen and Chris were talking about regulators. I just wanted to talk about probably the most famous SEC enforcement case related to Yahoo. It was a 2018 case, not long after this 18 guidance. It was kind of an extreme circumstance. If you remember what happened there, Yahoo had been hacked and Russian hackers had stolen a term that we heard earlier from Chris, the crown jewels, which is usernames, email, addresses, and all that. And the SEC, and this was a big deal at the time, the penalty was $35 million in this enforcement case. And the SEC Director of Enforcement said, "We do not second guess good faith exercises of judgment about cyber incident disclosures, but we have also cautioned that a company's response to such an event could be so lacking that an enforcement action would be warranted. This is clearly such a case." So it's along the lines of what Jen said. I mean, you can't put your head in the sand. I mean, that's a phrase we used to use a lot. I think it's common knowledge now that you can't hide from these things. I mean, this is something that we all have to address, whether you're, a public company governed by the SEC or not. Go to the next slide. So when I was preparing for today, I was hoping that I would have new SEC guidance for you to talk about, and we could talk for a long period of time about the new guidance that was coming. In June of 21, as part of the new administration's agenda and the new SEC's agenda, they announced a focus on disclosure regarding cybersecurity risk governance, whatever that is. And they said that the Division of Corporate Finance was going to issue new rules in October. And if you've ever seen SEC rules, this would have been probably a 100-page discussion about the issues and then a long series of proposed rules soliciting comment from the public. I could have talked about that for an hour alone. I don't have anything to talk about because that did not happen. So we don't have any more guidance from the SEC about how to think about these things from a disclosure perspective. So now what? You know, what do we do? We really are in a new era of regulation by enforcement. And a lot of you have heard about SolarWinds. Obviously, that's been a big deal. I've worked with many clients on inquiries relating to the SolarWinds incident. The SEC is just digging around in that, frankly, asking lots of questions of lots of companies, of advisors, and everybody trying to understand what happened, what the issues are, and how companies of all sizes, huge companies, small companies, are approaching these issues and how they're making decisions about disclosure. And they're frankly going to be second guessing. I mean, that's the concern with regulation by enforcement, is that we're second guessing. And the SEC is saying, you know, you should have done this, you should have done that. And of course, that's always with perfect hindsight. And as a defense lawyer, that's what we're trying to guard against that. But I think that I want to talk about 3 actions this past summer that I thought were significant. In the first one, this was, and enforcement actions again are very rare, and you probably heard about some of these because it was quite a big deal when the SEC started going after companies for disclosure incidents and failing to make proper disclosures. The first one was in June of 2021. The company failed to make some disclosures about certain cyber vulnerabilities. The worst case hadn't come to pass, but the SEC got wind of the issue, and so the claim there was that the company had failed to have proper disclosure controls and procedures. There obviously are rules about disclosures for all financial aspects of a company. There's particular rules about how to keep the books and how to make disclosures. There's no particular rule, as we just learned, with respect to cyber, but the SEC has kind of layered the cyber problem onto the disclosure regime and said, you know, you failed to maintain proper disclosure controls and procedures. You didn't have a process to get this information to the right people to make a decision about a disclosure for these cyber vulnerabilities. The penalty in that case was $487,000. So not too severe, but the SEC did say that the company had waited too long to make any disclosure, and they blamed it on the controls and procedures. The second issue happened a couple months later in August. The company's published disclosures referred to cyber risk in hypothetical terms and failed to disclose that the event had actually happened. And so when the event leaked out, the company made matters worse and said in a media statement that the breach may have included certain customer info when in fact it did. And this goes to the point I made a little bit earlier about risk disclosures in the SEC context. You can't say that the risk exists, and you can't say that things may happen or that you're vulnerable to certain things if they are happening. If they happened or they are presently happening, you have to say so. Because it's misleading. It's misleading to investors to say there's a risk of this, or this may potentially happen if in fact it's happening. And investors might behave differently if they know that these things are actually happening. In this August 2021 security matter at the SEC, enforcement matter, the penalty on this one was $1 million. So a little bit more significant. And the SEC again was upset about the, disclosing that things may have happened when they actually had. Finally, also a few months ago in August, there was another one involving broker-dealers and investment advisors having deficient cybersecurity policies and procedures requiring the protection of customer information. As Chris described, financial advisors, this is a big one. There are a separate, disclosure regime for investor protection in this area. The fine in this one was $750,000. So I think this got a lot of folks' attention. People are thinking, And I'm talking to clients all the time who are thinking longer and harder about, all the work that goes into considering what the risks are and what do we say about it. And so where do we go? Where do we go from here? We'll have to follow up at the next conference with what the actual SEC rules are, assuming we get them by then.
Yeah, Brent, we're having you back. We're having you back.
Oh, sure. Great. Well, good. I'll have something concrete to talk about. But I think the takeaways are that, you have to consider your industry. As Chris said, I mean, you got to think about what your risks are, what the industry risks are, what has happened in the industry. It's important to note that you don't have to give a roadmap to the bad guys. The SEC hasn't put out a lot of guidance, but they have been wise enough to say that, you need not disclose your particular vulnerabilities and to give a roadmap to the bad guys. Risk disclosures can't be about hypotheticals and what may happen if those things have come to pass and bad things have already happened. And then policies and procedures. I mean, it sort of goes along the lines of what Jen and Chris were talking about earlier. The SEC wants to see that you're thinking about these things, that you've got staff, you've got people who are creating policies and procedures to try to get the right information, to get that information to the right people. They want to know that you're thinking about preventing cyber breaches in the first place, remediating breaches that do occur, and that you're assessing the obligations that you have to disclose to your various constituencies in the event of a breach. As I mentioned, and when I was reading from that enforcement case, the Yahoo case, policies and procedures are easy, low-hanging fruit for the SEC. If you don't have policies and procedures, you're kind of dead. They can bring in an action against you for not being prepared, whether you've even had a serious issue. Disclosure cases about materiality calls are much more difficult, but I think the message is that you're going to have policies and procedures. And I expect when the SEC guidance does come out, there's going to be a lot of discussion about, how to craft policies and procedures, who manages the policies and procedures, and how that stuff works its way up to senior management and to the board of directors. And I think that's all I got, Jen.
No, that's great. I think this is something that's going to be ever changing. We just have to wait for more guidance, because every time we get another inkling or another enforcement case, it kind of changes, the recommendations we make. And I completely agree with you. I mean, in our space, policy and procedure development for so many reasons is just really low hanging fruit. The materiality issues are tough, and there's a lot of factors that go into making those determinations about what is material. I have been involved in a lot of those conversations, and I think it has to be a meeting of the minds from various different groups within an organization, and running that by outside counsel until we get more definitive guidelines, to be frank.
Yeah,
well,
I got a question, Jen, about board members being fined for vulnerabilities exploited. I haven't seen that yet. That would be a pretty pretty harsh result. I don't know if anybody else on the panel is aware of that, but we're not seeing that so far. I do expect the SEC, though, at least with companies the SEC has jurisdiction over, to start emphasizing more that boards of directors are going to be responsible for these things in certain situations.
We have seen those shareholder class action lawsuits, right? Where the shareholders are holding the executives accountable to how they're governing. This is going to be very curious, though, this disclosure. How do you disclose a regulatory governance risk without giving a roadmap to the bad guys? How you're like, hey, we're really vulnerable. Come hack us. We are not meeting industry standards. All those vulnerabilities that are happening to our peers, we're susceptible to all of them. How is that going to be conveyed in a meaningful way so that investors know, stay away or, take your risk? This is going to be very curious to see how this unravels.
Yep, absolutely agree.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I like about something like having the Verus community data available. Is you can say, in our industry, these are the things that happen more often, and we have programs that address that. It's a way of, saying industry specific, here's what's likely, and I'm not going to tell you where my vulnerabilities are. It gets you closer, I think.
I do think it gets it closer if you could actually say that by linking the data and saying we have developed our cybersecurity program and our policies and procedures to address, you know what I mean, likely or foreseeable threats. And if you do that by mixing it with the data, I think it'd be difficult to have an argument to say that you're not, or you're, having a misstatement. But I do agree. I mean, I think it's really risky when you get into anything more particularized, but you have to do something more particularized. I wonder if they'll give us examples. Probably not. But
No, they will not.
Well, not at first. So that's why this is going to be a real thick stack of proposed regulations, and they're going to solicit comment. And people like you guys are going to be like, oh, wait, look, we can't disclose this, or we shouldn't have to disclose this. And there's going to be a big debate. Yeah. And then, that'll take us through the next meeting, Jen, and then maybe a couple meetings later, the rules will come out.
And perhaps that's the reason for the delay. I mean, it's difficult because there's all these different stakeholders, federal government, state, attorneys generals. I mean, there's all these different places coming together, and sometimes they don't check with one another. Yeah. So, I mean, perhaps that is why we're seeing some delay of, well, exactly what are you asking organizations to do? When, I mean, we have a hard time getting anonymous threat sharing data shared between organizations. I mean, let's just be clear. People don't even want to anonymously, and there are protections to participate in ISACs and various different threat sharing mechanisms. People don't even want to do that on an anonymous basis, let alone lay a roadmap, in a public document. So I don't know, it's interesting. We're going to have to follow it, but it's something to consider. And we'll wonder when we see guidance. But we do follow all these enforcement cases, and Brian certainly is, the expert here at Foley that does that. So if you do have issues about reports, please let us know. In particular, Brian, that can help us kind of walk through until we get more definitive guidance. So thank you. I just thought this session was honestly amazing. I really do think this is where it's going. If I were in person, I would be walking around making you ask questions. If anybody has any questions on the phone, feel free to jump on in. We're going to hang out for just a few minutes here, do some networking, or you could type it in the chat box. Or if these things are things you do not want to talk about in a publicly recorded event, please feel free to reach out to us, afterwards. But thank everyone so much, and thank you, Haylock, as always. Just excellent program. We're going to follow up with some materials, with the slide presentation from today, and we'll let you know the exact date about our next meeting in January. Does anybody have any questions? Thank you all again so much. I hope we can see you in person in our newly renovated offices for a beautiful view of the Milwaukee skyline. And we're going to definitely record our sessions, but we would also like to do those both in person and online. And so we'll be working on that for our next meeting. Thank you all so very much. And again, thank you, Chris and Terry and Brian. Have a good evening, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Take care.